You're listening to podcasts from the Congressional Internet Caucus Advisory Committee, www.netcaucus.org.
All right, folks, welcome to another Congressional Internet Caucus Advisory Committee briefing. Thanks everybody for coming for this recess briefing. We're going to try to do this really quickly in 1 hour and explain this issue from a pro and con perspective. The briefing that you've walked into, at least you're in one place, is the new FCC privacy rules for broadband providers. What will they mean for privacy? And this is hosted by the Congressional Internet Caucus Advisory Committee in conjunction with the Congressional Internet Caucus itself, which is chaired in the House side by Congressman Bob Willett and Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, and is chaired on the Senate side by Senator John Thune and Senator Patrick Leahy. So we are super supportive, appreciative of their support and the fact that they allow us to host these briefings in conjunction with them in a fair and balanced way. And their ability to say we don't care where our particular perspectives are, but we just want to actually have a debate, pros and cons on these issues, and let congressional staff decide where they come on the issue. So before I get going, just a few little bits of housekeeping. If you want to follow the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag for today is hashtag FCC privacy. That's #FCC privacy. And you can follow us at NetCaucusAC, and that information is on your list here. We don't have any upcoming events, but we'll probably notice one in a week or two. So probably next one will be on the IANA transition for the Department of Commerce and Internet Governance. So keep on the lookout for that. Let me introduce, we have pros and cons on this particular issue. And let me just introduce quickly my panel. Right from the left here is Jim Halpert. He's with DLA Piper, which is a law firm here in town, and he's a partner there. Next to him is Debbie Matthews, and Debbie is Vice President of Privacy at CTIA, which is a collection of wireless and cellular phone companies. And next to her is Katarina Kopp, who is Director at the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a great privacy and civil liberties firm, nonprofit in Washington. And next to her is Laura Moy, who is a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law School. And all their Twitter handles are on the page. So why are we here today? Yesterday, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Communications Commission proposed a rule governing privacy issues related to broadband services and covering broadband service providers. They're basically updating a law from 1996, which incidentally is the same year that the Congressional Internet Caucus was created. So 20 years ago, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was passed, which included a law governing the privacy of telephone service. And also, the Congressional Internet Caucus was created that year. Incidentally, the top one song on the Billboard Top 100 was the Macarena. I don't remember what type of phone I had, but it really wasn't portable. It was a very, very different day, and the Congressional Internet Caucus was created that year to try to bring more attention to internet issues. So this is a really interesting collision of old and new, and what are we here for? So the FCC had a notice of proposed rulemaking. They want to do a rule to update these privacy rules for telephone providers, now what they're going to call broadband service providers. And our panel is going to kind of explain that and then debate the pros and cons of that. So we're going to go through a lot of material very quickly. The rules governing privacy for broadband service providers, and they include folks that provide your cellular service, not the phone itself, but the service that I get here, which is T-Mobile. Over your laptop or your desktop, which in my case at home is Verizon Fios, but here it's on the house public Wi-Fi. And so those are the types of services that we're talking about, broadband service providers. And these rules are covering them. So let's just go to my first question, and Jim arrived just in time. For the people out there who, the 9 questions, like, that name sounds really familiar, Jim Halpert, where do I know that from? And you're probably Googling Jim Halpert, the first thing that comes up is that guy from The Office. Jim, just so we get this out of the way so you're not bugged all Jim is actually named, he's the inspiration for Jim Halpert from The Office.
That's right, and you'll find I'm much less exciting than the actor. For what it's worth, I had dinner last night with the real Andy Bernard, who's another childhood friend who was in town for a World Bank economic conference. But let's talk about how this arose first. basically, the FCC has been trying to find a way to impose net neutrality requirements on internet access providers. And after a couple of attempts, it decided to classify them as common carriers, and just by virtue of providing broadband service. When the original CP&I law was passed, the internet access providers were considered independent internet information services and were not regulated at all by the FCC. This new classification, through a quirk in the way that the Federal Trade Commission law works, are outside the authority of the Federal Trade Commission. So before this net neutrality order, internet access providers were regulated and subject to the same requirements as anyone else in the internet ecosystem or any other business. It's just this FCC rule changing the way that this service is classified for purposes of telecom, that all of a sudden we have this change in authority over internet access service.
So this is an offshoot of the Open Internet Order, aka net neutrality.
Right.
So what is the Commission proposing? It basically is proposing a privacy regime that includes notice, like telling people, consumers, what their privacy rights are, choice, whether you can opt in or opt out or keep them from doing that collection, and then security, which is like how are you going to keep my data secure when you collect it. So what does the rule specifically kind of look like, and what is the CP&I thing that we're worrying about?
Well, Tim, we don't yet know the exact text because it hasn't been released, but based on discussions in public, it sounds as though what the FCC would do is to require an enormously long list of information to be provided to consumers by way of notice of what the data practices of the Internet Access Service is, and then set up a multi-tiered set of permissions, degree of opt-in or opt-out that would be required for the Internet access provider to use information that it obtained by virtue of providing this service to consumers. So there would be a very unusual opt-in consent requirement for any disclosure of information to a third party. We'll talk about that, how that may be a little bit less unusual, but certainly for internal uses of information for purposes, for example, of advertising or marketing. That would be sharply restricted unless requiring an affirmative opt-in consent, unless the marketing was for something that was related to communication service, so an existing service that the consumer required. There would be an opt-out for that sort of marketing. So the default rule would be opt-in with an opt-out rule in place for marketing communication services or marketing those services through an affiliate.
So if I could just jump to Laura. So what, for the average consumer at home, what does this mean for them? What does it mean for their privacy? What companies are they interacting that will be covered by this rule? And kind of what is so unique about broadband service providers that we need such a rule?
Okay, all right. I'll try to take those. I'll try to get to all of those, and just to do a little bit of background here. So before we start talking about consumers and exactly what this means to them, I think it's worth talking about what the objective is with respect to consumers of the law in the first place. So, I think that this is something that we could probably discuss at length because I'm sure that there would be differences among us panelists over what the primary goals of the statute are here. But basically, the section of the Communications Act that governs common carrier privacy, the privacy obligations of common carriers, which in the past were phone providers, now include broadband providers. Essentially, it kind of had two goals, right? One was to protect the privacy of information that consumers have to provide to carriers to get service. So that's like, when you're talking about common carriers, you're talking about companies that where their primary function is to carry the customer's communications from one end to the other. And so in that context, if you're making a phone call or browsing the internet, or using any online service, you have no choice but to provide certain information with the carrier about the traffic. So with a phone call, you have to provide information about the phone number that you're calling, the length of time you're talking on the phone, etc. And with internet traffic, it's kind of similar. You have to provide information about that enables the broadband provider to route the traffic from one place to another. So the customer pays the carrier for service and has to provide information about their communications in order to get that service. And one of the goals of the law is to protect that information, basically to make sure that the information isn't then being used for other purposes other than to direct the traffic or to direct the calls without the customer's approval. And then the other objective is a competition-based objective, where the FCC actually for decades prior to the 1996 Telecom Act had been regulating customer proprietary network information, and we hearing us refer to this as CPNI, had been regulating it on a competition basis, because there was this idea that if you have carriers that are seeing lots of information about relationships that their customers have with other companies by virtue of the fact that their customers are calling other companies, then there might be competition problems presented if the carrier can then use that information to give itself a competitive edge to compete in other markets. So a really good example of this is with an alarm service, where if you're getting home security from one provider, then if your phone company starts offering a home security system, it knows who you're a customer of for home security. It might even know when you've had an incident based on your call logs. It might know how often you're contacting customer service with that other home security system, et cetera, and that could be information that it could use to gain an edge for itself. So these are kind of the two goals. So for consumers now, the broadband has been reclassified as a common carrier service, again, with the routing of communications from one place to another. This means that broadband consumers can expect to have a very similar privacy framework to what has been instituted with respect to the information that they provide to their phone carriers. They can expect to have very similar protections in place with respect to the information they share with their internet provider. So the websites that you visit, the services that you're using, that you're in contact with, the destination of your traffic and the origin of it, the duration, the amount of traffic, that type of information, as Jim described, will now be subject to this sort of like multi-tiered consent structure.
So that information would be protected, and the ISP would not be able to collect it. Does this rule apply to sites like Google, like Twitter, like Snapchat, or the apps on my Motorola phone and the operating system?
Good question. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, so just to address one part of that though, these rules are not about collection, they are about use in general. So that, because there's an assumption that carriers have to collect the information, that customers have to provide it to carriers, and carriers have to collect it in order to provide the service in the first place. So yes, but that aside, no, these rules don't apply. At least, based on what we know about the proposal, again, as Jim said, we haven't seen the text of the actual proposal yet. But based on what we know about it, no, it would not extend to edge services. And
okay.
So there are companies that provide both edge services and internet carriage, and when they are in the business of providing broadband access, then they'd be subject to the FCC's rules that protect the information in that context, and when they're in the business of offering edge services.
Okay. So the phone that I have in my hand, it wouldn't apply to, like, I'm looking at my apps. It wouldn't apply to my Fitbit app. It wouldn't apply to my Google Mail, my Pandora, or really the operating system. This happens to be an Android operating system. Mm-hmm. The other major operating system, you might have heard of it, it's iOS by Apple. It basically
it's been in the news a little bit.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Right. It would not apply to those other entities. This is just about broadband internet access service providers.
Okay, so let me ask whether everyone's aware of this or anybody aware of this. What is so special? Like, really, what is so special about broadband service providers? Mm-hmm. And is this regime similar or different to other privacy conditions. Now, we had a briefing down the hall last week on the EU-US Privacy Shield. We had a fellow from the European Commission, and he's like, the reason why we have to do this kind of band-aiding is because the U.S. has an inadequate level of privacy protection in our opinion, and that being the European Commission's opinion. So what's so special this particular broadband service provider, and what do they see that's so special?
Sure. So, thank you, for that question. I think you have to look at sort of the whole context of this data. So it's not so much that it's particularly sensitive data, but it's the whole context. So a customer who uses the internet at home or on the phone, there's a large amount of data that is being collected. It is sensitive and detailed information, and there's really not that many options for a customer to sort of switch the provider or evade the situation. So it's the amount of information detailed and really the opportunity for the customer to not really go anywhere else. And if you think about the kind of profile that can be collected about a user, a lot of important inferences can be made about a user. So you can understand, for example, the usage patterns. You can draw conclusions about whether somebody, for example, is unemployed because they suddenly start using their home internet service more frequently during the daytime. The kind of devices that are being connected to the internet, again, in the home setting, for example, a pacemaker or your Fitbit. There's a lot of information that can be gleaned from that. So it's the entire context that you have to look at. I know that the FCC, for example, looks at the sensitivity of the data, and, for example, says with regard to health information, it's particularly sensitive, therefore there's an opt-in required. I think it's important to not only look at the sensitivity of the data, but then that's the next step, also the purpose of the data. So I think that's where we get into a little bit more when we talk about the proposed rules. It looks at the entirety of the data, but then what is it being used for? And I'd be happy to go into that a little bit more.
So we'll come back to the 2 points about not being able to go to somewhere else, and then also the sensitivity of the data, the uniqueness of the data. We can come back to that. But let's go quickly to Debbie, and can we focus more on the mobile ecosystem, because that's who your members represent.
Sure. Yeah, so the mobile ecosystem, as you know, as Tim was just talking about, involves a lot of companies who are providing the service to you. The ISP is one of those companies that provides the connectivity, but it isn't always the same ISP when you're using your phone. If you think about you're at home, you might connect to your home Wi-Fi, and then when you're out taking transportation to work, you're on your network connection. Once you get to work, you might connect with your work Wi-Fi. If you go to a coffee shop, you might be on the coffee shop Wi-Fi, and you use your network connection when you're in a park because you have no Wi-Fi connection. So throughout the day, you're certainly using more than one ISP. And if you take a look back at the original purpose of the privacy law that we're talking about here, the Communications Act, you look at the voice services market, which is, you had really one phone company back in 1996. You made a phone call from your house, they delivered it to someone else, and that was the only company. You had two companies, and everyone that was within that phone services market was covered by the law. Here, by applying that same law to internet service providers, you're only applying it to a tiny subset of the number of companies who are delivering internet service to you. So from the ISP's perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and really from a consumer's perspective, it doesn't make sense because there's a lot of confusion that will ensue if you have one set of rules that you have for ISPs and then other companies who are handling the exact same data, in some cases even more data, because if you think about using your phone and you're bouncing around from one ISP to another throughout the day, you might be logged into some services throughout the day consistently no matter which ISP you're using. So if you have an email provider or a social network, you may be logged in that entire time, so that social network, email provider, or search engine would be able to see all your activity throughout the day, whereas any given ISP would only see a fraction of that.
So we have a difference of opinion between you and Catherine. Catherine is saying, well, there's the sensitivity of data and it's unique. You're saying that, well, there's the data that the ISP would collect isn't all that different from what other apps or operating systems would collect. Right. Why are we being treated differently? Is that the
I think so. I think that the market has just changed so much. I mean, the smartphone has changed so much of the way we communicate. And while in the 90s, when we first got the internet, everyone had their home connection. You sat at your computer and you worked on the computer for a couple of hours, and maybe then you turned your connection off because you had to dial in, right? And now we have an always-on connection, and you're seeing ISPs all over town. It's just a very different market, and there is a lot of competition, especially in the wireless market. Think about when you were watching Super Bowl, how many of those ads were for wireless companies trying to get you to switch from one wireless provider to another wireless provider. It's very unlike the market that was around back when this law was passed, where there was a monopoly phone provider.
And I think one of the challenges here is that in an overall internet ecosystem where there is potentially tracking of users in a variety of different ways, probably the simplest thing for consumers to understand is that they can go one place and opt out, exercise control. That's if you read the legislative history of the CP&I law that Congress passed as part of the Telecom Act, the key concept was to give consumers control. Control can mean an opt-out or it can mean an opt-in. If you're in a market, there's a small percentage of markets in the United States where there's only one landline ISP. If you have an opt-out, you can still object and exercise your choice, provided that's presented clearly. Similarly, with the rest of the ecosystem in the Internet, there are self-regulatory mechanisms like the Digital Advertising Alliance opt-out. One could work on that further and spread its adoption even more broadly, and ISPs could be part of doing that. But if this order goes through, ISPs are going to be subject to a unique, far more restrictive set of privacy rules than apply to virtually any other sector in the United States, and they'll be separated out from and not be part of a unified system where consumers would have control, and consumers may not understand, it probably won't understand, that the opt-in request that they get from the ISP doesn't apply to anyone else in the Internet universe.
Let me go to Catherine or to Laura. And basically, we need to clarify what opt-in or opt-out is. Opt-in is basically like the ISP has to say to the customer, we're going to provide the service and we're going to use this information in the following ways, and here it is. Do you want this? And you have to do something, but basically it's like yes. So that's opt-in. Opt-out is like they do it, they provide you notice generally, and then if you say, I don't really want to do that, you can click on something that says, exactly correct. And it manifests a lot of ways, but that's basically it. This is an opt-in regime. And why should this be an opt-in regime? Can you defend those?
Yeah, so I think, again, these are really important distinctions. Opt-in requires an affirmative action. Opt-out assumes you don't have an objection, which, okay. So here, I think what the FCC right now is proposing, we know this from the fact sheet, so we do have some idea of what they have in mind, is sort of these three buckets with regard to the use of the data. So the first bucket is sort of this implied consent. You don't really need to ask the customer to do anything because you might need the data to use for maintenance or sort of security purposes. And then also for a service that is really for marketing, using the data for marketing for the same type of service that the customer already has. Again, no action is needed. So let's say you have a certain data plan and you need an upgrade for that. So no further action is needed. Now, when you then look to the opt-out regime that they're proposing, again, you have to look at the use of the data. So it's for marketing of communications-related services. So these are the use of the data that you signed up for a particular purpose. Now the ISP wants to market you related services. It seems to make sense that you can expect that the customer would be interested. It's related. There's a certain expectation that makes sense to say, we assume you're okay with this until you tell us otherwise. The third bucket really is for any other purposes, to use this data for any other purposes. So I think it's fair to say that you cannot assume that the customer is okay with that unless they tell you affirmatively, yes, I would like for you to tell me what other things you can offer me, and then I agree to that kind of practice. So I think you have to look at the purpose for the use, and that's really critical. And so I think that's a sort of a fair approach.
So yeah, I think it's interesting because that kind of scheme is found. I don't think that's ever found anywhere in the rest of the marketing rules that apply to companies in the United States. It's on. So if you think about a company that is offering you clothing and they decide to go into the shoe business, or they go into a completely different business, they're selling hardware or something, they are fully able to say, hey, we saw you bought some clothing and we'd like to sell you something completely different. And they're not restricted from doing that. So I'm not understanding the sensitivity of marketing different kinds of products and services, especially when customers probably want to get discounts on different products and services that a company might offer. And an example of that was just yesterday or the day before. Sprint came out with a new offer that you can get Amazon Prime by the month as opposed to Amazon Prime for the year. And this would be a benefit if you only want to have Amazon for, say, the Christmas season. You want to have free shipping, for example, during Christmas season, and you don't want to pay for it for the whole year. Well, Amazon, or Sprint, would be potentially, I don't know, these rules are a little unclear, we haven't seen them yet, but they would not be able to market that to their customers and let their customers just know about this new offer unless the customer had affirmatively said, I want to get marketing offers from you, as opposed to saying, hey, here's a marketing offer for Amazon. You can get it on a monthly basis. It's October. You're going to get ready to go Christmas shopping. And the customer can say, oh, gosh, I don't really want that. Maybe I'll tell them not to send that to me anymore. But a lot of customers are going to say, wow, that's a great deal. It doesn't give them a choice if they have to affirmatively say back in February when they sign up for service that they want marketing emails or not, because how are they going to know that the Amazon offer is going to be so great for them?
So I think, I would challenge actually this argument that we don't have anything like this anywhere else in the U.S. privacy regime, because of course the most obvious place where we have a very similar framework is with respect to phone information, with respect to information that customers share with their phone carriers, where there's a very similar privacy regulatory framework that applies to that information. The information that a customer shares with their phone provider, or that the phone provider has access to solely by virtue of its carrier-customer relationship, the phone carrier can only use on an opt-out basis for marketing of related services, and it's on an opt-in basis for marketing of unrelated services. And again, I think there's a couple things here. So one is, if you're talking about what the privacy justification for that type of regime is, well, again, it's important to remember that privacy is context specific. Consumers feel that their privacy has been violated when they think that information has been used out of context, or in violation of the norms that they apply to the way that they thought the information would be shared in the context in which they first shared it with their provider. And we do see in the phone context or in the internet context, if where a consumer is sharing information with their carrier for purposes of routing traffic or for purposes of routing phone calls, they expect that the information will be used in that way and not that it will be used for marketing purposes. We see this in other types of information or other contexts where consumers have no choice but to go through a particular provider for a service that we think is generally essential, like health.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit.
Right.
So in the United States, we have this kind of patchwork. I don't know, I'm not saying that in a negative way, but we have different types of regimes for different types of privacy. So, for instance, in Congress, it passed the CPI law back in 1996, which is being updated now. We have in the past Broadband that covers financial information. We have HIPAA, which is the Health Information Privacy Act. We have, and those related to just generally non-internet types of data. Really, the only major legislation that we have related to internet privacy is the COFA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And that's data about kids online. That's very specific. And then lastly is an overlay. Jim mentioned this earlier, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not the expert here, you guys are. We have the Federal Trade Commission Section 5 Act. So the Federal Trade Commission can say, if somebody says, we're going to protect your privacy, we're going to do it this way, and we're not going to give your information here, but we're going to use it for this, if they they make that promise and they fail to follow up with it, whether it's online or offline, the Federal Trade Commission, which is the other common week here, can come in and say, you didn't do what you told us you do regarding the privacy, and we're going to slap $20 million fine.
Yeah. Furthermore, both the Democratic-controlled White House and the majority Democratic-controlled FTC issued reports on privacy and the way that they thought privacy should work in the United States, that established a bunch of best practices that are widely followed in the business community. And both of those thought that there should be no choice whatsoever offered with regard to first-party advertising. Not opt-in, not opt-out. The EU Data Protection Regulation, which you heard in the Privacy Shield discussion last week, Europeans think is way tougher than U.S. privacy law, does not require an opt-in consent for first-party advertising. So this first-party advertising aspect of the CP&I rule would be the toughest or most extreme, however you want to characterize it, restriction on use of data by entities that you as a consumer have a relationship with. In U.S. law, if it were to go through without qualification. In the health context, there are limits, and in some aspects, first-party advertising is prohibited. Your doctor can't come to you and say, hey, you should use this drug instead of that drug. They can put up signs, but they can't use your information to go propose that to you. But if you go to a hospital, and some of you may have had to do that for good reasons or bad reasons, and you enroll, you check into the hospital, you get marketing communications from that hospital because they know that you've been to the hospital, and they start offering you other sorts of services and other sorts of things through their hospital. This would be a limit only on offering essentially existing types of services that the broadband ISP currently offers to a consumer with some small types of upgrades. So to give you an idea of how that's different, or how that made sense in the context of the telephone network, which Laura was talking about before, as of 1996 when the Telecom Act passed, from the way the Internet is today, you need to think about what the competitive purpose of the CP&I law, which Laura described second. But it really is an animated. If you read the CP&I law, there actually are requirements on the incumbent carrier, the incumbent phone company, to disclose to competitors subscriber lists so that competitors can go market to them and try to get service, or they can shift service over to, if they choose to sign up with a competitor. There are restrictions against trying to win back customers if a customer decides to switch to a competitor. And the competitive concern, if you look at the original CP&I rules, is that the incumbent, which has all these, your local telephone company, which had all these customers, would use that information to try to keep large control of the market. In the context of the telephone network, which was, as Debbie explained, a closed network, there was no question about advertising. There was no advertising over the phone network. We're now in a very, very different world of the Internet where there is a lot of advertising, and this would effectively be saying only for this category of people can need opt-in to engage.
So you're saying two things. One, in coming off my comment about patent, different types of privacy regimes for different types of data, you're saying no fair that ISPs are held to this higher standard compared to the other privacy regimes.
And more importantly, confusing.
And then number two,
and customers can't get the offers that they're getting from other companies.
And then number two, the competitive environment under which the original CP&I rules were passed make, you're saying, I'm not saying this, but you're saying that they seem not to make sense. Well, I would just ask Katarina and Laura to respond to that.
Yeah, sure. So with regard to the consistency argument, right, that we need consistency and clarity, CDT and the host of, public interest organizations active in this space, we have all advocated for a long time for the need for baseline privacy legislation for the entire ecosystem, for all the players in this space. But absent such legislation, which is unlikely to come anytime soon, and with the FCC having that authority and in fact the responsibility to protect the privacy of broadband customers, we feel they have to take that step, and that's an important step, and we'll see what has to happen afterwards. But that's the sort of the context we operate in. and we feel that consistency is an important goal, but it is not sort of the sake of consistency. We want to have the right protections, the right standards, that really customers feel that they have control over their data. And just to pick up on this control piece, I think we have to look a little bit at the evolution of this space. And we have, yesterday the commissioners, many of them cited the Pew study that's come out earlier in the year. And there's another study from the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania that really talks about how customers, internet users, have lost a sense of control over their data. They're resigned. They feel that they don't trust the institutions in this space. So I think for the purpose of the robustness of the economic development and people really wanting to engage with the technology, it's really important to give customers and users and citizens a sense of control over their data back.
Yeah, the problem, though, is that if you give control to customers over a tiny segment to certain companies that hold the data, when the data is flowing freely throughout the rest of the ecosystem, they're going to get a false sense of security, perhaps, that, I've opted out or I've opted in to certain things, and that's going to apply across the board when it's not, because all those other companies, and not even just the companies that they directly interact with, like the social networks and the search engines, but the companies operating behind the scenes, the advertising networks that they've never even heard of, the data brokers, their operating system, they may not appreciate that the operating system that's on their phone is seeing all the data, and they're seeing it in an unencrypted way. The ISPs, as we talked about a little bit, I think already, about encryption, a lot of the internet is becoming encrypted, and so the ISPs are unable to see any of the data that's encrypted, and at the same time, the other companies on the internet can see that data. So there's a real disparity it's sort of like taking a howitzer and shooting it at a mosquito. I mean, it's like a tiny little segment of the ecosystem, and all that data is going to go everywhere.
So I have a few things. One is, I think there's definitely a desire by the companies, an understandable one, to try to make it sound like ISPs and other companies that are operating on the internet and collecting information and marketing with it are the same type of entity, and that consumers have the same type of relationship with them. But they don't. I mean, consumers pay their ISPs to provide them with service. They pay their ISPs to get them connected to the internet, and then once they're on the internet, they make choices about what services they're going to use online or on the internet, or however they're using the network. And that's, but as an initial matter, they have no choice but to go through an ISP in order to get onto the network in the first place, and that is different. There's a different value exchange where they're exchanging money in a subscription, generally in a subscription context, for access to the network, and that's what they're paying for. That's what they expect they're getting. There is this difference with the fact that they have to go through an internet access provider to get on there. And I can choose whether or not to use a free email service where I understand that I'm sharing information about my communications with the email provider, and sharing that information in exchange for getting email for free. But I can't choose whether or not to build a relationship with an ISP and share lots of super sensitive information about my communications with them to get on the network.
That's really interesting. So what you're suggesting is, at least in part, and this is only the first part of what you're suggesting, is that consumers and customers and people using the internet have come to this convention of their expectation of privacy that if they pay for a service, that they want to just get that service. But for the free services on the internet, like Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat, there's a built-in assumption that they're bargaining for a free service. They're bargaining something. Maybe it's perhaps advertising.
I'm not necessarily saying that is always the case. I mean, I think that there are probably situations where people. I think that it is questionable in some situations whether people understand that the information they're providing will just be used in whatever, they clearly don't read privacy policies, they don't necessarily understand how their information will be used in exchange for a free service. But I do think that the relationship that they're building with their broadband internet access service provider is one in which they believe that the relationship is one where they have subscribed to a service specifically to go online, and that's the service that they think they're getting.
Well,
not an advertising service. Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
Chairman Wheeler, he said in his statement that most of us understand that the social media we join, the websites we visit, collect our personal information, and use it for advertising purposes. So he's suggesting what you were suggesting, but you're not suggesting as strongly as he's suggesting.
I mean, in some ways it is an empirical question, but yes, I think in general, people probably understand more about how their information will be used, or at least consider it in the context of considering an optional service and considering to engage in an optional service than when they're engaging in a service that is essential. I mean, and I also think just on the point of first-party uses of data, again, they're different types of service. You can expand, if you're a company that provides internet service and you want to expand into advertising, that's fine, but you don't have a right necessarily to use the information that you've collected in the context of routing traffic in the broadband access service, provision of broadband access service. You don't have a right to use that information to build this other business. And if you saw a health insurance company expand its business into advertising, start moving into start up an advertising arm because it's a giant and has a lot of money and wants to move into advertising, you wouldn't say, okay, yeah, go ahead and use this is first party use of information, go ahead and use all the information that you know about insurance.
Well, wait, so we're talking about opt-in versus opt-out. We're not saying they have a right to do it without any choice. We're just saying why should consumers have to choose specifically to get better deals on products that they might want to get? Why can't they just get the offer, and if they decide they don't like those kinds of offers anymore, they can opt out, just like it is for all of the other companies in the ecosystem. There's nothing unique about an ISP offering the deal. So Uber has cars and they drive you around, and all of a sudden they start offering Uber Eats. Should they have been prohibited from telling you about Uber Eats unless you specifically said, oh, I want to learn about food offered from Uber? It doesn't make any sense to me.
So just in terms of framing this debate that you sort of opt in to get better offers or additional offers, I think what a lot of the folks in the public interest community and also the civil rights groups have pointed out, that this data can also be used to sort of disadvantage you. So it's not always about you getting great new offers, but that there might be information given from you that might be used to your disadvantage. So that's where I think it makes a lot of sense if people want to have control over that.
Well, first of all, the NAACP president has written saying that it did not make sense to focus on this particular area. Secondly, essentially, a lot of the advocacy for this proposal and even the logic of what the FCC has said is, well, there might be particular uses of information which are unfair to consumers, discriminatory, intrusive. The way that the Federal Trade Commission approaches this is to say there needs to be opt-in for specific types of uses. Laura also equated an ISP just a few minutes ago with a hospital or a healthcare institution that opens a healthcare advertising network. That under the federal trade
compared, not equated, but sure.
You drew an analogy.
Yes, I do.
Absolutely. And the point here is that if there is sensitive data that is being obtained through provision of Internet access service, under the old Federal Trade Commission framework, or the framework that applies to the rest of the Internet ecosystem, it makes sense for the FCC, now that it now has done something regulatorily, which means that it rules this roost, it should apply the same set of standards for which would be opt-in for uses of health data, a prohibition against use of information in a way that would discriminate against consumers. Probably, if there was analysis of absolutely all the data that traveled through a system, that might also be worthy of opt-in consent. But instead, what we're seeing in this proposal is opt-in consent is the requirement for all of these buckets of uses, regardless of whether there's any health data, any discrimination, anything else. So I think we need to take that off the table for purposes of the purpose of this, because it would be much more narrowly tailored and precise to focus on things that actually might cause some consumer harm. From what we know about this proposal, it also applies to not information that contains your name, but information that could be used to identify you. So it's very, very broad. All the data that an Internet access provider might have, it might be linked to your account, even if it is not in fact linked. And that's a huge amount of information that would be subject to a lot of regulation.
We're just scratching the surface here, and I'm sorry we don't have that. I do want to drill down on 2 points, but I do, before we, I want to go to questions from the audience. But before we leave, I just would ask you guys to try to explain what happens from here before we leave, and what is the role of Congress in this entire rulemaking process, since they originally wrote the law. So, any questions from the audience? John. He's going to bring the microphone over to you, and it won't go through the speakers, but it will go through the network, so just talk away.
Okay, John Peacock, Carnegie Mellon University. Two of you have emphasized the fact that there are different rules for different players. But the FCC, if what you want is the same rules everywhere, the FCC can't give you that. They have Title I authority over commercial broadband internet access providers. They don't have authority over Starbucks when they provide me internet access. The only way to get that is legislation. So are you calling, the congressional staff in this room, are you calling for broad-based privacy regulation across all of these, or legislation across all these providers?
So do you want to opt in for privacy legislation from Congress, or do you want to just be opt out of this FCC rule?
I think to be clear, the previous FCC requirements which can be placed into regulations under the FCC's own framework. There's a proposal that was submitted to do that.
Yeah.
There is nothing to stop the FCC if it's going to, as it's proposing in it's talking about regulating all information, not just CP&I that's received by an internet access provider. If it has the authority to do that, it certainly has the authority to go beyond the structure of CP&I and to replicate essentially the FCC framework with the FTC framework, with opt-ins for use of sensitive data, opt-ins for prohibitions against disclosing any information that might be used for profiling or ways that might discriminate against data. All that is within the FCC's authority if, as it says it can, it's going to regulate all customer information received.
So there's sort of two ways to do this, just to answer your question. You could pass legislation, and there has been support among many in industry to have one overriding privacy law to simplify everything in the United States, and that's certainly not all of industry is unified behind that, but there are some. But I do think that what Jim was saying is to harmonize it with the FTC's framework is a good way to go, because the FTC's framework has resulted in very strong enforcement actions against huge companies, and I'm not going to name them here, but huge companies that you have heard of that last for 20 years and provide really strong protection. But at the same time, there's enough flexibility in the FTC framework, unlike what the FCC is proposing. There's enough flexibility to allow for all this new kinds of innovation that we've seen over the last 20 years in the Internet. And that's been the model that's applied across the Internet so far. And to try to pull into a very restrictive scheme where there's lots of very specific notices and very arcane choices is not going to promote any kind of... It's going to make it really hard to make innovation around the ISPs. So I think that it's a serious question to ask as to how we want to move, what direction we want to go. Do we want to go more prescriptive for everybody, or do we want to have a flexible system that has served this country very well, especially as compared to other countries that maybe haven't had as much innovation? They don't have Silicon Valleys.
It's a question that's going on, in my view, for at least 18 years, certainly, very, very strongly. And let me ask, before we do John's question, let me go to Katerina. And John suggested that why don't you just go up to the Hill and ask for privacy regulation across the board and be opt-in with the Center for Democracy and Technology Support omnibus privacy legislation up on the Hill, and would it be opt-in or opt-out?
Well, we've been on the record. Of course, that we would support baseline privacy legislation, and I think we would have to look again at the particular context of the data and the purpose of the data, whether that's whether it's opt-in or opt-out. It would have to be differentiated.
So, if I can just add, so I think it's worth noting here that these are not mutually exclusive options, right? I mean, it may be the fact, and I would argue that it is the fact, that it is appropriate to have high standards for internet service providers because of this special relationship that they have with consumers. And it's a relationship where you want to encourage consumers to build this relationship, to get on the network, to be willing to connect, and then to consider the services that they want to use online accordingly, but not to be afraid to take the first step to get online because they're concerned about these possible practices that ISPs might be engaging in. And opt-in framework is great for that because the default is privacy protection. Do nothing, go online, build a relationship with your ISP, do nothing, and there will be very strong protections for your information, the information that you have to provide by virtue of the carrier-customer relationship. Information that you're optionally providing in other contexts, maybe it's appropriate to have a different framework, but not in this context. And that's not mutually exclusive with perhaps needing baseline privacy legislation to protect information that is sensitive, maybe is being used already in ways that most consumers don't agree with, and that maybe the FTC's framework is not adequately addressing. Yes, and it's not.
That might have made sense back when there was one ISP per person. But as I was saying earlier, we have so many ISPs, and there's so much competition in the marketplace. Let the ISPs compete for this kind of business. It's just so different now than it was back in 1996. I appreciate your point. It's just the market has changed so much.
It is different, but no matter where you are going first through an ISP and then online.
Yeah, so you're going through a free Wi-Fi hotspot that's not regulated by the FCC, so they can go ahead and just use your data then? Because they're not going to be regulated by the FCC.
If you look at what consumers actually do in the course of a day, they access the internet at work, they access the internet at home, they access the internet on their smart device, they may go through a bunch of Wi-Fi locations. None of those entities has all that much information in the context of the way that consumers are using the internet today.
You can draw.
You were positing one internet access provider with a special relationship. Think about how when I connect through the house Wi-Fi, I'm entrusting the data that flows through, unless I put in a VPN. When I connect at Starbucks, same thing. This is not the monolithic world of 1996, and I think you're positing a special relationship here without a polling data to support it is questionable. Okay. But also you have. In any given situation, if you have a customer that's paying you a lot of money, you're going to be very cautious, and I think you see most of the ISPs being very cautious about advertising. Sorry.
Was that to your satisfaction, the answer, John? Any other questions? Any other questions, ma'am?
Let's stand.
Wait for the...
I find a lot of inconsistency in your arguments, Abby, in that you say these offers are so valuable, these consumers will just, it's so terrible that they would be able to get these wonderful offers from Sprint or whoever. If it's so wonderful, why are you so assuming that consumers would not be jumping at the chance to opt in? It seems kind of...
They may not understand what the offers are going to be. And like I was saying, so let's say you sign up for service in January with a new ISP, and they say, would you like to opt in to marketing offers? And you're like, I don't know. If they say, they're going to be really great marketing offers, but they can't specify what they are because they don't know what they are yet. And then comes October, and there's this great marketing offer for free shipping on Amazon or something, and they can't make that offer because you haven't opted in. Are they going to pass? I just don't understand how how the consumers are going to know what the offers are before the offers are even out there.
And can I ask, I don't mean to hijack your question, but what is the practical effect of opt-in versus opt-out? We're throwing them around pretty casually here.
And also, how does it hurt to get an offer? That's the other part that I'm not clear on, like just getting an offer and you end up not taking it. You get offers all the time.
Question. I would say that probably in reality the problem is more people aren't getting the offer, because I assume that if Amazon and Sprint are going together to offer this to somebody, they're doing it on the basis of some kind of data, whether it's, let's say you buy a high-end data package that you never use. Okay, then maybe you'll buy a high-end delivery package and a high-end video package that's probably both, and not use it that much, which will increase the profits to Amazon. But some consumer could really use this wonderful per month thing for December or whatever. They're not going to see it. They're basically going to be redlined.
Why do you assume that? What is the interest in not trying to get as much of the market as you can?
you want to get the part of the market that gives you a profit. That's why you use the data to find the part of the market.
Presumably, they all would generate some profit. You're supposing that there isn't an interest in serving middle and low-income consumers. If you look at the money that, and for example, Comcast has put in hundreds of millions of dollars to wire low-income neighborhoods so that they get broadband.
Prime by the month. We're not talking.
But it could be something else. You just don't know what it is. I'm not saying that this is a wonderful opportunity for consumers. That's not my point. But to assume that there will always be nefarious conduct in advertising wouldn't really be economically rational. And it also would apply to the entire advertising ecosystem, of which ISPs are a blip. I mean, most of the online advertising, 70% is by 10 companies, and none of those companies are ISPs.
Katerina and Laura dying in answer to this question.
Well, I just want to jump in on the opt-in. I'm pretty confident that companies can come up with pretty creative ways to explain the value proposition that companies, why customers should opt in. And if it's an opt-in, they will have to really make that extra step. With an opt-out, you basically as a company, you don't have to do a whole lot. Again, the assumption is until the customer objects, you can market. So I think I'm pretty confident the companies can come up.
Sorry, and if I can just add, I think it's also worth noting that this regulation that is Title II privacy regulation, the regulations that we're talking about that apply to internet service providers, or that are being proposed to apply to internet service providers. And again, this is all we haven't even seen the text yet, and we're not quite sure where it's going to go. But a lot of these are great questions that will be addressed in comments in the record. But this is activities-based regulation. It is not entity-based regulation. And what that means is if a company is both an internet service provider and the operator of an advertising network, then it can continue to operate under the FTC's general opt-out framework with respect to privacy regulation in this area where it is engaging in advertising. It just cannot use the information that it's collecting from its broadband customers in the context of providing broadband service that broadband customers are giving it to route their traffic for that purpose alone. It can't use that in the advertising context without opt-in consent.
Okay.
That's,
we're running out of time. If anybody has a really burning question, I want to finish with the last. But I didn't get to. There'll be a lot of questions about how much and this goes to the heart of the question, is how much the unique perch that ISPs and broadband providers have with regard to data. You'll hear a lot of debate about how much can they actually see, whether it be because they're splitting up, people are accessing it on Wi-Fi at McDonald's, or they're accessing the house with Wi-Fi, or then a lot of the data is encrypted. That's a question you don't have time for today, but you'll hear a lot about that one, and I would ask you to ask a lot of questions about that, and just differences of opinion. And then the other one is that where does it go from here? I'm sorry we don't have the text of the notice of proposal we're making, but from what I understand, it's like 500 questions in the text beyond what they're saying about the rule. Where does this fit? What's the process from here? Just really quickly, if I can ask a few of you to say, and what is Congress's role, since they crafted the darn thing?
Yeah, they did. So we're going to get the text of the rule shortly, I think. There's no consensus as to exactly when, sometimes today, maybe next week, early. And there'll be 2 comment periods, and it'll probably extend through a good half of the summer. And there'll be an opportunity for companies, consumer advocates, other interested parties to comment on the record, and members of Congress to comment on the record. But Congress is faced with a pretty a fractured set of laws that apply to some companies and not apply to others that are holding the same data. So I think that Congress does have a strong role to play here to smooth this out and make sure that the data is what's protected, not just data that's held by certain companies.
So we'll be seeing hearings over the summer on this, and probably a lot more discussion up here in the Hill about those rules. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
I'll let you have one last parting comment, and really quickly on.
One thing to think about is whether you're satisfied with, the members you work for are satisfied with the speed and availability of broadband in your congressional districts. And in connection with that, think about whether you want a unique, pretty burdensome regulatory structure to apply to use of data that's obtained through providing those services. And then think about how easy it is to set up an internet advertising business with almost no capital investment. And think about what that might do to investment in your district.
I'll just touch on the point that we didn't really get to, which is encryption. And this is obviously a debate that's much broader than this, because encryption is everywhere. But there is more encryption, and the more encryption that we have going forward, the less that ISPs are going to see, and the trends are very clear in this direction. So just think about that as you're thinking about some of the other larger encryption debates, how it's going to impact this proceeding, because to regulate ISPs more when they're seeing less and less every week because more companies are encrypting is a question that needs to be considered.
I'm going to skip over the encryption comment, but just CET is really excited about this debate because we think this is a really important debate for our society at large, and that I would encourage everybody to just sort of broaden this to your constituencies and educate people about these issues and get involved in this debate, because I think it just really touches upon some fundamental issues, and the more educated we are about these issues, the better. So thank you for hosting this.
And as my final parting thought, I would give that I think that it's important for us to think about the justifications for some of the really strong privacy laws that we have, and it's to protect relationships where we really want people to engage freely with an entity and to have free and open communications, and that's why we have strong health privacy laws so that people will go to their doctors and feel free to talk to their doctors about their health status. It's why we have lawyer-client confidentiality, which many of us in this room, I'm sure, are well aware of, so that clients feel free speaking candidly with their lawyers. And it's a reason to have really strong privacy laws that apply to internet service providers, so that people can take that step of going online and know that their traffic is going to be routed through an ISP without being concerned about how that information will be used.
With that, I'd like to thank the Congressional Internet Caucus co-chairs, Chairman Goodlatte, Congressman Matthews, Senator Vin, Senator Leahy. Thank the panelists, and thank